first thing that you need to think about when you're creating a character is what role they're going to fill in the story. You have your primary character roles, secondary character roles, and minor character roles. The primary is only going to have your protagonist and the antagonist, which is just as important as your protagonist. These are the most important characters in your book, and they are going to have the most page time. The secondary character roles is going to be your love interest, especially if you're in a romance. It's going to be the sidekick character, any mentor characters or confidants, the people that your protagonist or your antagonist can always turn to, and that helps them along the way to learn the lesson they need to learn or defeat the villain. And yes, the antagonist gets to have these characters as well as the protagonist. Now, just because these characters often offer guidance and support to the main character and the antagonist, it does not mean that they only exist for that purpose. These characters should be their own characters in their own rights. And then finally, all the other characters are going to go into that final category of grouping, the minor characters. So that's going to be any service characters, any background characters that are only there for like one scene. So you have like the baristas at a coffee shop, or maybe the mailman, the literal messenger, anything like that, taxi driver. These minor characters do not need as much work, but try not to make them completely robotic. I usually prefer to go ahead and assign maybe 1 or 2 traits to them so they kind of have like a this is their thing kind of deal. If you want a really good example of this, Stormfront by Jim Butcher, there is a character in the first chapter. His job is to deliver the mail. And he's kind of a skeptic, and he definitely has a lot of character to him, and that's literally just what he does. Now, that brings us to the second step in this process. Once I have determined what role in the story this character is going to fulfill, I will consider what their misbelief is. Now, the misbelief, I like to think of it as more of a lie. It's deeply ingrained in your character, and it's a lie that they have believed about the world or about themselves, usually since they were very young. Examples of this could be, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough, I'm not worthy of love for such and such reason. This lie is going to shape how they move forward in your story. It's going to shape the actions they take, the decisions they make, how they react to certain situations and characters, and more importantly, it shapes their view of life, which is going to be much more important when we talk about character voice. These misbeliefs are going to create a push and pull within your character, which is going to give you the internal conflict that your story needs, which is going to be the backbone of making these compelling and relatable characters. These aren't just minor insecurities. These are powerful misconceptions that define the character's worldview. And like I said, normally this starts at a young age for the character, but there are several other steps where it's reaffirmed for them until it's so deeply ingrained, they probably don't even notice it anymore. This is going to be the reason that your main character is going to be troubled or flawed at the very beginning of the book. It's going to be everything that's wrong with their life. And ideally, you are going to shape this misbelief until it is unique to your character. It's perfectly fine to have it simpler at the beginning because it can always change throughout the course of your story. You're probably wondering, how do I figure out what this misbelief even is? You can think about the truth that your character is going to learn at the end of the story, or sometimes it's called the theme, and then flip it upside down. So, if your character needs to learn to love themselves despite what other people think, their misbelief is going to be, I have no self-worth apart from what others see in me. See how that works? You're going to want to do this for both your primary characters and secondary characters. You're not going to need to know as much about them, but it's still good to go and have this baseline so they can have their own character arc. The third step in this 5-step process is going to be figuring out what your character wants. Now, this is subject to change throughout the story at any point, but you always want something that they want at the beginning of the story before the inciting incident, though it usually does change by that point. Otherwise, you just have a character kind of wandering aimlessly. If they don't have something to pursue, they don't have any motivations to push them forward, you are not going to have much of a story, and it's not going to be much of an interesting read. Your reader's going to find it very boring. So, usually this want is going to be in conflict with the misbelief. The misbelief is going to keep them from getting what they want. So, let's go back to the example of them having a misbelief that they're not good enough. Well, maybe they are a violinist and they want to get into Juilliard. That misbelief that they're not good enough is going to stop them. Maybe they don't even try to apply. Maybe they decide that they're not good enough at violin and they don't practice enough, which makes them not good enough. Or they bomb their audition because they've already decided before they went into the room that they weren't good enough. Obviously, they're not going to get what they want. Right? The fourth step in our 5-step process is going to be figuring out what they need. This is what the character actually needs in their life to fix their problems. So, for example, maybe this character that believes they're not good enough and wants to get into Juilliard, they think, well, Juilliard is the top school, and once I get accepted, once I'm going to school there, I'll be good enough in the eyes of everyone around me. And they believe that's going to fix their problem and why they feel the way they do. But what they actually need is to accept themselves in spite of everyone else's opinions. They need to believe that they're good enough. So going to Juilliard really doesn't have anything to do with that. And they can still want to go to Juilliard, but what they need to fix their problems in life is to accept themselves. And that's going to be the truth and the spine of the story. It's going to lead into your character's arc. So step 1, figure out what role this character plays in the storyline. Step 2, figure out why they believe about the world that is ruining their life. Step 3, what do they want or desire that they think will fix their life? Step 4, what do they actually need to fix their life? And finally, that's going to bring us to step 5. And this is going to be incredibly important also to figuring out subplots and the antagonist of your story. You want to figure out what is the worst thing that could happen to this character. What do they fear the most? And this is important because once you know what this character fears the most, especially if the antagonist or the villain knows about it, they can play into it and they can set your protagonist up for failure. It's going to make plotting your book a million times easier. So you want to think about what's the worst thing that could happen to them. What is going to bring them the lowest. Let's take Harry Potter as an example. So Harry's greatest fear is losing the people that he cares about. This stems from him losing his parents. And throughout the series, you can see he's very protective of his friends. Oftentimes, it makes him go it alone, and he tries to go ahead and go around his friends and not tell them the things that he's struggling with. But he can't go and solve the problem by himself. He needs them. The only way that he solves the problem is when his friends step in and are there to support him. This is important to think about because then that will help you decide what is going to happen in the story, and it's going to give you a very clear direction, very clear subplots. This often plays against what they need, they want, and it's going to get in their way every single time, every single step, every trial they come across, obstacle that challenges their misbelief, which is the important part of the story because you want these obstacles that are going to challenge the character to reconsider this misbelief they've had. Because if they continue believing this lie, they're not going to change by the end of the story. And in some cases, this is good because you might be having a negative character arc. However, it is still important to know the flip side of that misbelief. That way you know how to send them further into believing this lie. The first thing that either comes to me is either their name or their appearance. However, I normally can't start writing a character and have it feel like a character until I've figured out what their name is. Now, this might be different for different writers. I know some writers who can go ahead and in like brackets, they sub in a name that might work for this character, and they're able to change it later with no issues. But for me, it's very inherent to who my characters are. So this is where we'll be starting today's video. There are several ways that you can go ahead and explore this. And there are several things that you want to take into consideration when naming your characters. Things like the genre of your book, the time period it is set in, whether it's the past or the future, or if it's just some world that you've created. You might want to go ahead and consider their species, or if they come from a clan or from a kingdom. The biggest mistake you can make when naming your characters is to have them all sound too similar or the same. You want your readers to have clarity. You never want your reader to be confused about who's talking, who is, in that scene, who's the main character. You always want this to be very clear. One question you can ask yourself when you are considering your character's name, do you want your readers to like them? I don't want to say that, you can't name your character something, but what you do name them is going to leave an effect on the reader. So, for example, Charles Dickens has a character named Mr. Squeers. What kind of character do you think that is, right? Leaves a certain impression. Or to take a very classic example, you have Voldemort in Harry Potter. Voldemort, probably not the protagonist, right? If you knew nothing about this book, you would see that name and you'd be like, oh, that's probably the Dark Wizard. That's the guy that the protagonist has to defeat by the end of the series. And then the other thing that you want to consider is if it's futuristic, how are you going to go ahead and convey that in your names? Is there a reason, if you're not going to look at more futuristic names, is there a reason for this, that they kept all of these older names in style. If it's medieval times, you want to look at the kind of names that people had back then. And there are a ton of websites online that can go ahead and show you like where a name came from, how long it's been around, and just things that you should think about. You also want to consider the world they're from, especially if you're doing fantasy or sci-fi. If this is an alien species, how can you make them feel more alien to your readers? How can you make their names relate to their species? So, for example, let's say you're writing a book about, or not, let's take Avatar with the blue people, the Na'vi. You probably wouldn't go ahead and have a native Na'vi named Bob, right? So you want to consider their language if that is a factor in your book as well. You probably wouldn't be walking down the street of New York and meet someone named like Tok'ra or Torvu. No? I mean, you might nowadays, but just things to think about to help cement your reader in the world and with the characters that they're going to be on this journey with. Also, because you want to make sure that your names are different amongst characters, if you're doing a fantasy or anything that has like different species, different clans maybe of people, so like it's the same species, but you have like clan 1, clan 2, like in Avatar The Last Airbender, they have the Water Tribe and they have the Fire Nation, things like that. Having different names amongst the different clans can help your readers differentiate who belongs to which clan, and it can help chunk information so they don't have to remember too much when reading your story. They can enjoy it and understand it with clarity. That is the main goal here, is to have clarity for your readers. Another thing to consider is how similar the names amongst your characters are. Even if you don't have different clans, you don't have different like species, and say you're writing a novel with a group of teenagers, they all go to the same school, they all grew up in the same town, you still want to make sure you're not confusing your reader. And so one way to do this is to make sure you vary the length of your names and you vary the rhythm, the spellings, the sounds in these names. For example, you wouldn't want to have 3 characters named Sue, Susie, and Shelley. They're very similar. Your readers are going to get them mixed up. It would be better instead to have like Sue, Elizabeth, and Margie. Those are all very different names. They start with different letters. They have different sounds in them. They end differently. You want to consider the first sounds, the last sounds, the length of the spellings. However, that isn't to say that they have to be wildly different at all. For example, in one of the novels that I'm writing, I have 2 sibling groups, and one of the sibling groups, they're each named after a color. So that also is another way of grouping them together. And there's a reason for why their names might seem a little similar. Or the other sibling group, I wanted their names to be simple, and they are shorter. They are spelled differently, but they kind of have similarities that can go and be like, oh, these are the siblings. And that can be fine. When I am naming my characters, I like to go on Pinterest and I will look at different boards that have character names. Sometimes I will look at like names of places or like constellations, planets. You can go online and there are name generators you can use if you just want to randomly generate something and see if it sticks. Scrivener, if you use that writing program, which is the program I use, Scrivener has a built-in name generator that you can play around with, and you can customize it to have it be like, English names, or I think they have so many, like Chinese names, English names, Egyptian names. You can put in what the last name is. You can adjust what you want it to start with, and it'll go ahead and generate so many different names for you. You can look up baby name websites, and you can look through those. You can look at the etymology of the names, where they came from, see if that relates to maybe your character's backstory, and it can add another layer to your character. Now that we've talked about names, let's talk about appearance. And as I said earlier, sometimes I'll do these in reverse. For me, it's important that the look of the character matches the name of the character. Sometimes I figure them out concurrently as well. For this, I like to go on Pinterest and I will look at portraits. Sometimes I already know kind of what I want the character to look like, so I'll type in some of those attributes. So if I know she's blonde with blue eyes, I'll look up images of girls with blonde hair and blue eyes until an image strikes me and I'm like, that's who I am envisioning in my head, or near enough, just so I have a feeling of the character for myself. That way I can write it and give the readers somewhat of a similar feeling. And for this, like I said, I go to Pinterest. You can just Google it. Or if you're an artist, you can draw your own characters and play around with that. You can go into video games, especially like video games like, I know Cyberpunk 2077 has so many modifications you can do to your character, and you can play around with that. to get an idea of how these characters are going to look, their heights, their builds. These are very important things to think about and know for when you start writing. For example, if you have a character that is very tall and your characters need to get into this very small air vent, the tall character is probably not going to be the one to do it. Or if they're by themselves, they're going to have to figure out another route to get to whatever they need just because they physically will not fit. Whereas if you have a small, petite, tiny character, they're going to fit no problem, right? This is another thing where you want to consider, if you're doing fantasy or sci-fi, you want to consider, are they human? Are they alien? Are they like fantasy characters? Like, are they elves, dragons, mermaids? Do they have scales, wings? And this is going to inform how they move, how they see the world, how they think. These are just things to go ahead and keep in mind because they are going to affect your story as a whole. So now that we have named our characters and we have an idea of what they look like and how they're going to interact within their world, we can give them character traits. For this, what I like to do is I will list out traits that I like in people. For example, honesty, loyalty, reliability, kindness, animal lover, things like that. Just put down a list of all the traits you can think of that you admire or like, and I want you to do the same with traits that you don't like. For example, for me, I don't like liars. I don't like cheaters. I don't like bullies, anyone who's cruel to animals, things like that. Write down that list as much as you can. And if you have difficulty with this, there are also things like trait thesauruses that you can either maybe look at your library, online library, or you can purchase them if you want them on your shelves. And that can really be helpful for this. Once you have all your traits down, I want you to pick about 4 or 5 of the positive traits, and you're going to give those to your protagonist. And maybe 2 or 3 of them to the secondary characters, and maybe 1 to any minor characters. And then you're going to do the reverse for your antagonist and their second characters and their minor characters. So for the protagonist, you're going to choose 4 or 5 negative traits, and you can give that to them. Now, keep in mind, you don't want everybody to have the same exact traits, so do try to keep it varied a little bit. And then, we're not done, you're going to go back to your protagonist and their little group, their cohort. And for the protagonist, you're going to give them at least 2 to 3 negative traits. Because remember, if you want a fully fleshed out character, no one is just pure good and no one is just pure evil. So you want to have 2 to 3 negative traits for your protagonist, and you want 2 to 3 traits that are positive for your antagonist. This will also be really helpful if you want your antagonist to seem like a good character and then have it flip later. So this is very important, and this will help inform the way they see the world, the way they think about the world, the way they talk about the world and the people around them and in it. And then now that you know your characters lie that they believe about the world, you know what they want, you know what they need, you know what they're going to learn by the end of the story, you have a name, you have their appearance, you have these different character traits for them. They're not just going to be 2-dimensional sticks or stereotypes. That's another thing. Make sure you do not, unless you are purposefully crafting a story about stereotypes or saying something about stereotypes, you want to try to push those envelopes as well as you can if you want your characters to be memorable and unforgettable. And like I said, you also want to have your characters very differentiated within your novel. That way your readers aren't confused. And you want to consider this not just in their character traits. For example, you don't want all of your characters to be blonde and blue-eyed, unless that is part of your plot and there is a very good reason and some way that you are going to differentiate the protagonist out for your readers. Everything I'm telling you, it's not like I never do this. It's just, if you're going to do this, make sure you have a really good reason and it's not something that you've done by accident, because then your readers will be confused and they'll be like, why was it like this? And they might not even finish your book. Another thing that is going to be really great about differentiating your characters like this is that it will automatically give you conflict and tension within all of the relationships in your book and the groups that you might have. Your characters can have similarities. They might have common goals, might have common beliefs. However, they might have very different ways of going about these things, like accomplishing those goals. For example, if you have a group of characters and they are all united because they're trying to take down the empire, well, perhaps you have one character that believes the only way to do that is to go full violence, just tear it down, full anarchy. While you might have another character over here thinking, well, we need to be diplomatic about it and think about what comes after that. If you just tear it all down, how is there going to be anything left to rise from the ashes? And this can cause conflict between those two characters who both ultimately want the same thing, but they have very different ways about seeing the world and moving forward. And another thing, if all of this just still hasn't gotten you unstuck, you're still not sure where these characters are going to go or how you want to start them, you can always think about Carl Jung's archetypes. Now, archetypes and stereotypes are two different things. Stereotypes is like you have like your jock and a cheerleader. That would be a stereotype. However, archetypes, just for some examples, you have the orphan, you have the innocent, you have the hero. They're kind of like story roles that are found in each novel or story. You have the mentor character, just different pieces of stories. Character arc is actually pretty simple. Your character goes from point A to point B, and you have to figure out the steps in between to have it make sense for your readers and be logical as a progression. Let's talk about what different character arcs your characters can go on. There are 3 main types. The most popular one is probably the positive character arc. Sometimes it's called the hero's journey. This is where you have a flawed character at the beginning of your story, and they progress to learn a lesson or a truth about themselves and become a better, more solid, stronger person. And they not necessarily overcome all their flaws, but that lie that we talked about in that first video of this series, that lie, they subverted it, they have rejected it, they have conquered it, and they have accepted the truth that they have been missing this entire time. Now, I say they might not necessarily get rid of all their flaws, because flaws can continue throughout their life, and we'll talk more about this near the end when we're going to talk about using a character arc in a series. The next character arc that is pretty common is going to be the sometimes called the flat character arc, or also occasionally called the growth arc. For this arc, there's not too much change happening. It's more that your character grows more into who they are and more into their beliefs. Occasionally, you can have like a shifting of opinion or perspective for the character, but not too much changes. Another way of thinking about it is that they kind of have to influence the worldview around them because they already know the truth that needs to be learned, and they're trying to help other people learn this truth. This happens a lot in dystopian stories, so think Hunger Games, Divergent. You have these characters who inherently know what needs to happen, what is wrong about the world, and they know what is right, the opposite of that wrong, and they strive to push forward and continue to believe what is their truth, and then continue to embrace it and grow into it. And they normally bring other characters into the fold because of their commitment and their conviction in that belief or truth. The other character arc is the negative arc, or occasionally called the fall arc. A lot of the times you'll see this in villain origin stories, but it doesn't necessarily have to always be there. It's basically where you have a character that already knows the truth, but they're tempted by a lie, and by the end of the story, they've become a worse version of themselves. Some examples of these different arcs. The most prominent is the positive character arc, or the hero's journey. Think about Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. If you want some flat or growth character arcs, Samwise Gamgee is a fantastic example of this. He really stays the same throughout most of the story, but he really just grows into his confidence and his courage and being a great friend. Another example would be, I think Legolas is a good example of this. Though there is an argument there to be had that he also has a positive arc. If you look at his relationship with Gimli the dwarf, you could say his flaw is that he's very judgmental. He's very elf-centric with their whole, dwarves aren't acceptable. But then by the end of the trilogy, he absolutely is best friends with this dwarf. And if you want more of that kind of character arc, look at the Hobbit movies as well. And let's talk about the negative character arc. This might be a little controversial, but I would say that Frodo Baggins has a negative character arc. He starts out as this young, happy hobbit who really just wants to help the world be better. He wants to go on adventures like Bilbo did, and he wants to do good. He wants to stop this evil ring from taking over the world, and he volunteers to go to Mordor to help people, just because he feels he can. And then by the end of the trilogy, he's in Mount Doom, and he has the ring, and he's dangling it over, and he can't do it. If Sam wasn't as good of a friend as he was, Frodo would be all alone, would be completely just isolated, and he likely wouldn't have made it there at all. But he cannot throw the ring into the fire, and he even plans to put it back on and disappear. He was going to leave Sam there. The only reason the ring got destroyed was because Gollum went ahead and attacked Frodo and ended up falling. That is the only reason that the ring was destroyed. So that is an example of a negative character arc. Like I said, most of the time it's a villain origin story, and I'm not saying Frodo is a villain, which is why I wanted to bring him up as an example, because it can be a really fun way to explore how your characters go forward, and this also will be really helpful when writing a series. So for formulating a character arc, you want to think about where your character is going to start and where they're going to end, because the main thing you want to be considering when you are drafting or plotting this arc is how is it going to affect your character's inner world? How are they going to change as a result of this arc and these things happening, these events? How is it going to affect the outer world? If you don't know where your story is headed, how can you know how your character will be affected? And if you don't know how your character already is, how can you figure out where they need to go? For example, I was recently creating a character for the novel I'm working on, and I was a little stuck by why he would do this thing I needed him to do. So I was thinking about it, and I realized, well, I know that by the end of the story, he's going to be really stand up, he's going to be very humble and confident, and someone that people look up to. However, the flip side of confidence is actually arrogance. So the difference between that is confidence is all about believing in yourself. You believe that you are good enough, you understand this. And arrogance is usually rooted in believing you're not good enough, and you look at other people, you kind of think they might be looking down on you, so you look down on them. A lot of times you'll have characters who are arrogant, belittling others, dismissing them, and really it's just them hiding their own insecurities. So now I have a character arc. He's going to go from this arrogant guy who thinks he knows everything, thinks he's all that, no problems, to someone who can actually grow into his actual abilities and realize that he doesn't have to put people down to be true to himself and to be good enough. So to figure out your character arc, ask yourself 3 questions. First question, who is your character at the beginning of the story and what are they like? Which, if you've been following the series, you should know a little bit about that. You should understand what their flaws are, what their lie is, what they believe, how that's affecting them, and then have some character traits that you can play around with. Question 2, what do you want your character to be like at the end of your story? The third question, which is probably the trickiest question, is what events need to happen to make that change occur? How do you take your character from this guy to this guy? With character arcs, it is mostly about transformation. That is the biggest thing that you want in a character arc. Either the character's transforming or they're transforming the world around them by staying strong to their beliefs and their ideals. Overcoming or succumbing to the lie or the misbelief is critical to having a well fleshed out character arc. But overcoming or succumbing to flaws is optional. Let's say I'm someone that has an issue with my anger and I want to be better about it. I want to be more patient going forward. That's great to acknowledge, but it's harder to implement. So every day I would have to take steps to try and achieve that goal. And it's going to be the same for your characters. But when you intrinsically believe something, let's say I believe I am not good enough. When you intrinsically believe that, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I am good enough. And you intrinsically believe that instead, your beliefs and the way you see the world is much harder to change than, the way that you interact with it. How to implement this into a story structure. So I went ahead and put together some of the more common story beats that you will probably want to keep in mind for your character arc. You have the setup, which is basically just introducing your main character and showing what is wrong with their life and what they misbelieve and how they are flawed by that. So basically showing the reader what needs to change for this character to be happy. Now, of course, if you're doing a negative character arc or a growth character arc, it might be a little bit different. With like a flat arc, you're probably going to be showing what's wrong with the world and how can the character's beliefs have them stand apart and help influence the world to be better. If you're doing a negative character arc, you're going to want to go ahead and show how this character is really great and how there might be a truth they believe, but you'll also want to show how they could be tempted away from it, how that lie can creep in and tear them down. Or if you're just going the route of having it like the positive character arc, but instead of accepting the truth, they reject the truth and accept the lie, then you would again show how they're flawed and what they need to learn. The next beat will be the inciting incident, and sometimes this is called the call to action, and this is just going to be the push that your character needs to force them to change one way or the other. And this is when all the events that are going to start challenging their lie is going to kick off. Next, you are going to have the midpoint, which is in the center of your story. And this is going to be when the character starts to get an inkling of what they've been going after, what they want, might not actually be what they need to fix their life. And they're going to start gravitating towards their need versus their want. This is not going to happen like immediately. Okay, you still have half a book to write, but gradually this is going to start being the change that they start to see and feel and understand. After that, you are going to have their darkest moment. This is when you bring your character so low because of that lie that they have been believing, that it's either sink or swim. This is when their lie is going to be challenged the most, when they're going to have to confront that what they have been wanting, what they've been striving for, isn't going to solve their problems. Or if you're in an arc where they're going to reject their truth and embrace the lie, this will still kind of be similar. That's going to bring us to the next beat, and that's going to be the climax. Your character may have already accepted the truth, but this is going to be the moment when they prove that they have learned their truth, that they're going to go towards what they need or accept what they need in their life to make it better and make them happy, or vice versa with a negative arc. And the biggest thing about this is, like, this is still going to challenge that lie. There still might be some temptation, especially if your character doesn't feel they're good enough. There's still going to be that moment where they prove to themselves and others that they have changed. And more importantly, they've proved to the readers that they have changed. Something to think about is the opening of your story, so the setup, and then the resolution, which is the next beat point that you want to go ahead and think about in your character arc. The setup is really just showing your reader, this is where we are, this is how this character is, this is what needs to be fixed with them, or what they need to fix or figure out. And then the resolution is where they can go ahead and see how far they've come. And a lot of movies do this actually. You can go look at the first scene with the character that has the arc and the last scene, and usually it is very, very different. And you can see how far that character's actually come, even though as you progress through the story, you might not be noticing it too much as a viewer or reader. Another thing I want to talk about, because I don't believe I touched on it in our character creation part 1 video, there's this thing called sometimes it's called the fatal flaw or the shard of glass. Most recently, I just heard it called the ghost. It's very connected to the lie that this character believes, but it's the event that happened in their past that made them believe the lie, that overran whatever truths or things they knew before to cement this lie into their very being and have it infiltrate the rest of their world and their relationships. And it's good to note that this might change in every single book. For example, with series, you can have a new ghost in each book, and that ghost can be caused by the previous book. And that brings us to character arcs over a series. And you can do this in so many different ways. For the character arc I was talking about earlier, you have arrogance to confidence. You don't want that to drag out over, say, like 3 different books. That will want to have your readers being bored, and they're not going to feel any closure at the end of the first book, the one that's supposed to draw them in. So in each book of your series, even though your plot might span the entire thing, each book you want to have some closure, and you want to have a full story. You want a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you want that to be the same for your character arcs. So the way to do this is you can play around with it. You can have a positive arc to positive arc to positive arc, and you can just jump off different lies, or like I was saying, you can have a new, like, the events of the first book. Maybe it ends and they saved the day, but they lost someone very important to them. That can create a new ghost and a new lie for them to conquer in the next book. And you can do all of that positive arcs. You can do it all growth arcs. Probably not all negative arcs. Those can be a little difficult for your readers to absorb at some point, unless you're trying to make a specific statement and be very deliberate. But you can also do a positive arc to a growth arc, or you can do a growth arc and then a positive arc. You can do a positive arc, a negative arc, and then another positive arc to have like a dip. Play around with it and see which one you like writing the best, which one makes more sense for your characters and the story you want to tell. It's very great to kind of plumb the depths of what came before in the story to show what's going to come next, especially since that's how life is. Like, you learn some lessons, and sometimes learning those lessons and the journey to learn those lessons gives you new problems to solve. You can drag those into the next book and have the character then have to focus on that. Or maybe the lie was just the biggest thing that they had to deal with, and now that they've solved that, they're forced to realize that there's some more layers to it. One thing I would say you don't want to do is you don't want to repeat arcs. I'm sure we've all had this where we'll watch like a television series and they'll just keep doing the same thing. I remember I was watching Once Upon a Time and The Vampire Diaries, and this happens a lot with villain characters. They'll have a villain character and they'll redeem them. I'm thinking Regina Mills and Catherine Pierce. They'll redeem them, and then they're like, oh, we kind of need a bad guy, and so they'll plunge them back into being a villain for some reason, and it's so irritating. Do not do this to your readers, okay? If you're going to redeem a character, and that's not to say that they can't still make bad decisions and they can't still have room for growth and learning. That's why I was saying you probably don't want to do a negative arc, a negative arc, a negative arc, unless you're doing a villain origin story. No, Bethany Atazadeh did a 3-book series for her character. I believe her name's Jezebel. She's basically the evil queen in these fairy tale retellings, and she talks about how she went from being a good person to being what is perceived as the evil queen and how she got so warped. I believe that is over 3 books. I highly recommend any of her books, and that is definitely one that did really well with navigating that negative character arc. And then finally, because again, I don't think I mentioned it in my character creation video, I wanted to give you a few examples of really basic, simple misbeliefs that you can start with for your characters and their arcs, and then you can make it more specific to them. There is I need to be perfect. I am not loved. I am a failure. I am not enough. I am not capable. I don't belong. I can't miss out. I can't trust anyone. And I don't matter. These are the 9 archetypal misbeliefs that you can play around with. These come from the Enneagram, which is a personality test. It's very detailed, and this can also be helpful with writing characters. I'm still playing around with this myself, but if you want, I'll link below. I know Abby Emmons talks a lot about it, and I think she just started a new series about character creation with the Enneagram. It took me a while before I started to consider character voice as a part of the writing craft, until one day I realized that all of my characters were sounding the same. They would have the same values, they would have the same turns of phrase, they would interact with the characters the same way. I was basically just transplanting one character from one story to another. It wasn't until I started to play around with point of view that I started to consider how I could shift it, how it could be different. When I first started writing, I started mainly with fan fiction. I really started to go and think about this when I would be writing from the point of view of a character from the series that I was writing about or in the world of. And I realized, well, they wouldn't really think this, they wouldn't say this, because from what I knew of the show, their experiences didn't lead to that. And so I started to consider, well, for my main character, my protagonist that I created to place into that series, they should also go ahead and be different. They should have things they wouldn't say, things they wouldn't do, certain ways that they would say things. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. So first, what even is character voice? You can think of character voice as a filter. Your character has lived a life and they've had experiences in that life. Every single experience they've had, just as with real people, it affects the way they see the world, how they feel about the world, how they interact with the world. It's the character's expression of themselves and how they're interacting with the world at that moment versus the author's expression of the world that they're seeing in their head as they're writing. The best way I found to do this is to create character cheat sheets. Basically, what this sheet is going to do for you is going to let you keep track of all of these little nuances that will be specific to your character. Also, before we dive in, I wanted to go and make a note that you don't have to worry about all this for your first draft. It's fantastic if you've already have it created, but don't stress out over, oh my gosh, did they sound the same? Did I implement this correctly? All of that can be fixed in the revision. You want to go ahead and make this character sheet, and it's okay to do it before you start writing the first draft, but don't get too hung up on it, because most of the magic of writing actually comes in the revision phase. On your character sheet, you're going to have a few things that you want to consider. First, you want to think about how old your character is. This isn't quite the biggest thing to worry about. This is more just a frame of reference for the types of experiences they will have had, how much independence they may have already had. So don't get hung up too much on the number. It's more about how they would see the world. I know there's a lot of people who think that when they write children, in the perspective of children, they have to dumb down a lot of things, almost make them seem kind of stupid or naive. The biggest thing is to think about how they see the world differently than an adult with all these experiences from the past see it. And then also the people around them are going to be very different as well. Another really big thing to consider with your characters is where they grew up. And this can mean a few different things. You can think of it on a broad scale. If they grew up in another country, you're going to want to think about how people in that country speak, how they act, how they see the world. For example, in the United States, we use miles versus kilometers. That's going to be a really big indicator of character voice as well. It'll just be a little tiny thing that will go and instantly be like, oh, okay, so I know a little bit something about this character because of this fact. It can also be, did they grow up in the really rich bougie neighborhood, or did they grow up in the slums or the more impoverished side of town? That's going to affect how they speak, how they talk, the kind of people they're around, the type of situations they're in. Another thing that you can consider about where they grew up: did they grow up in the city? Did they grow up in the wilderness? Did their parents live out in a cabin with nobody else around? Their only friends were like animals. And I touched on this a little bit, but you also want to consider who they've spent their time with. So if you are writing a character that is a child, the people that they will have spent the most time with is probably their parents or their caretakers. So that can go and influence how they see the world. If your character grew up in an impoverished neighborhood or a neighborhood overrun with crime and things like that, they would have been around people that maybe make questionable decisions. This will make them more on their guard, and maybe probably more paranoid, cautious, those types of things. Versus if they're around like these high elite socialites all the time who maybe don't always say what they're actually wanting to say, but they always have an angle to play, that's going to influence how they speak, how they interact with the world. Because since they're around people that always have an angle, they're just naturally going to also be thinking ahead. Okay, so this is what this is going to get me. This is what I can benefit from this. Can I benefit from that? What should I say to get this to happen this way? And that will go and change. Those two different characters we've just discussed would be massively different. You also want to consider what your character does for a living. It could be their job. Maybe they're a stay-at-home parent. Maybe they are in high school. That would be what they do all day. So not necessarily even for a living, but what do they do all day? What they do all day is going to carry into their worldview, their relationships, their internal and external voices. And depending on what they do all day, certain things will pop out that might not for another character. For example, if you have a character that's a lawyer, they might be really good at arguing or picking apart other people's decisions and actions. Versus if you have someone that does bookkeeping or accounting all day long, they might go through life looking at objects and be like, oh, okay, so this is what this is going to round up to be for like the whole year. Or they'll really be like crunching numbers in their head all the time. Or if you have a writer, they will be pushed more towards words and how that influences people, how people see the world, those kinds of things. Versus if you have a character that's a mathematician, and they'll probably see the world more logistically or analytically than perhaps an artist who would see the world in colors. Another thing you want to think about would be your character's personality type or their traits, which we talked about in the last video. I will link that below or right up in here. I think, yeah, it would be up there. So their personality type. I briefly mentioned the Enneagram, and again, I'm not going to go too far into it until I've done more research, but there are 9 types on the Enneagram, and each type have different values, they have different beliefs, they have different ways of seeing the world, different fears, and this is going to color how they interact. A great example is, I think it's type 7. This personality, they're afraid of missing out on the world. They are very much exuberant, outgoing, versus type 8, they are more focused about who can I trust. I can only trust myself. So they're very guarded and they don't trust easily. They will keep things to themselves more because they're afraid of how others might use what they learn about them. And if you don't want to worry about the Enneagram, you can just look at the personality traits that we wrote down for the last video and just play around with them. For example, a character that is broody with a lot of secrets is going to be very different internally voiced than like a bubbly personality that's super extroverted. You want to use these personalities to give your characters unique quirks to themselves that will help set them apart from the other characters, and you want to make sure it pairs well with their general attitude. So again, the optimist versus like a pessimist, they're going to see the world very differently. Another thing to make sure you think about is those negative traits that we gave your characters. You want to make sure to integrate that into their character voice as well. And for the villain, you're going to want to integrate some of the good personality traits too. And this is because nobody is just fully evil, nobody is just fully good, and this is going to make your characters more real and three-dimensional. If you want some examples, a suspicious character is constantly going to be mistrusting the people around them. They'll maybe suspect people more readily. If your character is selfish, they'll probably always be thinking about how a situation can work out in their favor, how they can get the most out of a situation. They probably won't consider others' feelings too much. That's kind of going into narcissistic land as well, but they're kind of close together. You can consider their sense of humor for their character cheat sheet. So if you have someone that has very dry sense of humor, they're going to be very different from someone who has a dark sense of humor, or someone that has like a dad joke kind of sense of humor. And then for the character cheat sheet, you're going to want to think about the hobbies that this character might have, what their job is. That can play into metaphors and analogies. For example, Liselle Sambury, in her book Blood Like Magic, she has her main character who is really big into cooking and baking, and she takes that on for her family. And it's a part of the story. She ends up entering like a food competition. She also thinks in terms of how those work together. I know there was a scene that stood out to me. She's grappling with the decision, and she has the metaphor of how, I think she was making bread, and how all the ingredients come together, or how she can make a recipe her own versus just doing what someone else did. So she can play off of things that have happened in her past and the traditions of her family, but she can put a twist on it and add her own little zest to it and find her own individuality within that without getting rid of the tradition and the part that was her family. So that came from this character's love of baking, which is amazing. I know Abby Emmons, in her book The Other World, she has a character that grew up on an island, basically secluded from the entire world. She uses a lot of ocean metaphors. She has a very poetic way of thinking, very whimsical, versus one of the other characters who is a bush pilot. He knows about like the sky conditions, and so he thinks in those terms as well. He's very philosophical, and that all feeds together. You also always want to consider the internal conflict that we talked about in this video up here, because that is also going to filter into this character voice. For example, if they believe that the only thing that will bring happiness is money, then they're always going to be looking at the world as a way of, can I make money from this? How is this going to make me money? If they don't make money, they'll be feeling down on themselves. They'll be very critical of themselves. If they see other people who are like rich and famous, they're probably going to be jealous of them and see them as being happier. Another really great tool to separate characters and character voice is to think about the way they phrase things. If you have one character that's always saying like, what the hell? You don't want every single character to talk like that. Otherwise, what makes them unique? How can your readers differentiate them? The goal here is to be able to have lines of dialogue and instantly know which character said that, which character would put that spin on it. And of course, this is different if it's a character that's relaying information, but they still have a little twist on it, probably. You can think of things like in superhero movies. Normally the superhero or the hero is going to have a catchphrase. Or in Doctor Who, if any of you are Whovians out there, Clara Oswald, she says, "Oh my stars," which I think is a really, really cool phrasing that I hadn't heard before I watched the show, and so it's very unique to her character. You might want to keep some dialogue or vocabulary specific to just one character, ways of phrasing things. You also can implement body language to help differentiate your characters and your character voice. I did this in one of my stories where I had one of my characters, when she was nervous, she would reach behind herself and she would tug on her hair. That was a nervous tick of hers. Maybe their character laughs nervously. Maybe they fidget with their hands a lot. So if you have characters that are doing things like that, let it only be that character that does that. Otherwise, if everyone's doing it, it's not going to be unique. Or I know one of the things in Doctor Who again, like David Tennant's Doctor, the 10th Doctor, he runs his hands through his hair a lot. And that's one of the things that makes him unique, in my opinion, from a lot of the other characters. Now, here are some bonus tips that you can use to help you get into your character voice. One thing to think about, especially if you're swapping point of views in your book, think about how the punctuation can lend itself to your character voice. Think about the function of punctuation. For example, maybe in one point of view, you separate clauses with an em dash, and in another you use the semicolon. Maybe you use parentheses to show like internal thought versus like italics. Maybe you use a lot of ellipses to show that they trail a lot in their thought processes. Don't go crazy. You still want it to be readable and legible, but you can put a little bit of a twist and just think about how that can differentiate your characters as well. Another thing that you can do is to use a different font while you're drafting. Not for the final published product, that you want the same font, but one thing you can do is when you're in one point of view, you can have one font and then have a different font for another point of view, and for another character point of view. And I would recommend both of these being different, or however many of these you have, I would have them be different from the final font that you're going to use, simply because at the end you do want it all to be the same font. You don't want to have multiple, unless you can, if you want to play around with formatting. You can do whatever you want, but it'll be a little against the norm and a little more difficult to market. But what happens when you use different fonts for different characters is as soon as you're typing in that font, you're like instantly in the mind space of that character once you do it enough times. And you can even play around with it. So if you have like a really edgy character and their thoughts are on the edgy side all the time, maybe you have like a sharp font. Or like if you're writing from, say, a serial killer's perspective, maybe go use like the kind of font you'd see in a horror movie. If you have someone super bubbly and like excited, maybe you use a bubble font. And then finally, if you want something that you can just try this out with and you're not sure how it is or how you'd even write multiple personalities and different character voices, take two characters, and this can just be for practice. Take two characters and make them polar opposites of each other. You can do the optimist versus the pessimist. You can do grumpy sunshine. And just play around with how they would see the world differently. And this can make it very, very different for you and very obvious to you. Just play around with it and experiment and see what happens. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, as always, comment down below. I will be making a video that is just an example of walking you through this entire process, everything that we've talked about in this video series. I hope all this is helpful to you. If you have any questions before I make that video, please go ahead and drop them down below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. If you want more content like this, please go ahead and like and subscribe. It really helps me a lot, and it helps me understand what you all are interested in, what I can give you, and what is of value to you. So, yep, let's keep having this conversation. Look forward to the next time. See you then.